Street Fighter, what an iconic game franchise. The reaction to the upcoming Street Fighter movie casting has split people clean down the middle, and in some cases into several smaller, angrier pieces that all think the other side has completely lost the plot. Depending on where you're standing, the casting is either an unforgivable betrayal of the characters, a complete non-issue being whipped into hysteria, or yet another example of Hollywood proving it doesn't understand the source material it's borrowing its credibility from. Street Fighter is a legacy franchise built on an international global roster, characters designed to be immediately recognisable not just by their movesets but by their silhouettes, national identities and visual shorthand that's been consistent for decades, and that's why this casting has landed the way it has. Several characters in a franchise defined by clear, exaggerated archetypes have been cast with actors who, on the surface level, look nothing like their video game counterparts. For a series where visual identity is the character, that disconnect alone was always going to provoke a reaction regardless of politics, intent, or whatever label people are rushing to slap on the criticism. So, in this video, I'm not here to shout at you or tell you which camp you're supposed to be in. I want to look at what's actually happening, what the casting choices are, why they've triggered such wildly different reactions, and how Street Fighter, of all things, keeps finding itself dragged into debates it was never designed to carry. Because if there's one thing this franchise has always done well, it's reflected the moment it exists in, and right now that moment is loud, fractured, and deeply allergic to nuance. I am Lady Decade, and if you like your gaming content spicy, then hit that subscribe button. Let's discuss why the Street Fighter movie casting is causing outrage. Modern gaming has got increasingly pricey in recent years, hasn't it? But fortunately, there's a fairly painless way to get access to most of the modern era without spending a fortune. I've put a link below where you can grab Street Fighter 6 Seasons 1 and 2 Fighters Edition at 30% off, or the Ultimate Season 3 Pass at 24% off. And while you're there, you'll also find discounts of up to 90% across thousands of other games, including pretty much every Street Fighter title that's ever existed. Each purchase will get you a bargain and go towards funding this channel, or if you want to support what I do in a more personal way and gain access to my classic behind the scenes Chun-Li cosplay photos and more by backing this channel on Patreon. No pressure, as always, just options for you to enjoy. Anyway, let's get back to why this film has managed to annoy so many people. From its very inception, Street Fighter was designed as a global fantasy, a deliberately exaggerated snapshot of the world filtered through martial arts, national archetypes, and larger-than-life personalities. It was never subtle and never restrained and never apologetic about how boldly it represented difference. That was the appeal. You didn't need to read a manual or listen to an explanation to understand who these characters were meant to be. You saw them, you recognised them instantly, and the world made sense. That is precisely what makes the upcoming movie adaptation so frustrating, because for once, the familiar defence of needing to make a franchise more diverse for a modern audience does not apply. This time, it's not a case of Hollywood being forced to retrofit diversity into a property where it does not belong. Street Fighter already solved that problem more than 30 years ago. Instead, what we're looking at here is something almost inverted, where a franchise built entirely on clarity, specificity, and exaggerated identity has been filtered through a casting philosophy that actively dulls those distinctions until they begin to bleed into one another. Looking at the trailer and the casting choices, the result is not bold, and it is not especially controversial either, but it is incoherent. Essentially, a lot of the cast look nothing like the characters that they're meant to be portraying. The key issue, and the one that tends to get buried under noise and deflection, is that Street Fighter characters were never written as realistic people. They are symbols. They're visual shorthand for fighting styles, philosophies, and national identity, exaggerated to the point of near parody. Ryu is not simply a man who practices karate and happens to be Japanese. He is a distilled representation of Japanese martial discipline, restraint, and internal struggle. His entire character revolves around control, denial, and the constant tension between mastery and self-destruction. Akuma is not just an antagonist with red hair and glowing eyes. He is the physical embodiment of what happens when that same discipline is abandoned in favour of raw power, a mythic warning rather than a conventional villain. Sagat is not merely a tall Thai fighter. He is the emperor of Muay Thai, pride, given human form, honour, wounded but not extinguished. And this matters because Street Fighter has never been about realism in the conventional sense. It's always been about recognisability, about silhouettes and physical presence communicating meaning before a single line of dialogue is spoken. Yet, defenders of this movie are currently jumping through all manner of hoops to justify why it's fine that the characters look completely different. The truth is, though, that when people insist that performance is all that matters, they're usually thinking in terms of grounded drama, where character is built through dialogue, backstory, and subtle emotional beats. Street Fighter doesn't operate in that space. It never has. It operates in the realm of iconography, where cultural coding, posture, movement, and immediate visual identity carry an enormous amount of narrative weight, and where altering those elements doesn't merely change a character, but destabilizes the entire world that they inhabit. Casting seems to be all over the place, so let's analyse some of the roster further. Street Fighter is, at its core, a Japanese franchise, so it's hardly surprising that a significant portion of its characters originates from Japan, roughly a quarter of the core roster appearing, in fact, with E Honda, Dan Hibiki, Akuma and Ryu all explicitly rooted there. What raises eyebrows, though, is that of those characters, only E Honda is being portrayed by an actor who is fully Japanese and actually born in Japan, and that's where the discomfort creeps in, because when even its Japanese characters are being represented through a very Hollywood casting lens, it starts to feel less like accuracy to the source material and more like approximation. The result isn't outrage so much as a lingering sense of inauthenticity, as though the franchise's roots are being gestured at rather than genuinely embodied. Andrew Koji, for example, who was set to play Ryu, is a fantastic actor and a genuinely gifted martial artist. And the point here isn't to diminish that in any way. He was born in Surrey in the UK to an English mother and a Japanese father, and what's been striking is how many Western Street Fighter fans have waved this away with a casual close enough or he looks Japanese to me, which is great and all through the eyes of a Westerner, but not so much for Japan. It's well known that Japanese audiences do not read identity in the same way Western audiences do. In much of the West, identity is often treated as flexible and self-defined, shaped by personal narrative, lived experience and cultural mixing, and that approach makes sense in societies built around immigration and assimilation, where belonging is something that can be negotiated and expressed. Japan doesn't operate on those assumptions whatsoever, though. Identity in Japan has historically been understood through continuity, ancestry, and social belonging, with a far clearer distinction between those who are considered inside the group and those who are not. This is not a value judgment, and it does not require approval or disapproval to acknowledge. It's simply a reality that any series adaptation of a Japanese property has to account for. For a Japanese audience, Andrew Koji would be understood very clearly as hafu, a term used for people of mixed heritage that doesn't carry an automatic insult, but it does carry meaning. He may very well be perceived as attractive, exotic, or distinctly Hollywood, yet the distinction is immediately legible. Because he was born and raised in the UK, was not socialised within Japanese society, so most Japanese viewers would be able to tell the difference almost instantly. This is where Western discussions often miss the mark, and it's one that any serious adaptation of a Japanese property, especially one as symbolically loaded as Street Fighter, should account for if it wants to claim authenticity. Physical presence matters more than any Western audiences tend to realise, from facial structure to posture to movement, restraint, and the way any discipline is expressed through the body. Acknowledging this does not diminish anyone's background or personal story, but it does mean that the way these performances are read cannot simply be dictated by Western expectations. And I'm saying this with a degree of personal clarity because, as you can probably tell, I'm mixed British and Asian myself. I'm under no illusion that if I were cast in a film representing a specific Sri Lankan character, Sri Lankan audiences would notice the difference immediately, not out of hostility, but out of familiarity. Acknowledging that doesn't diminish anyone's background or personal history, but it does mean that the way these performances are read cannot simply be dictated by Western expectations. Cultural legibility works both ways, and pretending otherwise doesn't make an adaptation more inclusive, it just makes it less honest. That is why the most straightforward, least controversial approach to adapting Street Fighter for a global audience would have been almost boring in its simplicity. Just cast Japanese actors for Japanese roles, and then apply the same level of fidelity to the rest of the cast. Not as a moral gesture or as a political statement, but as a practical decision that respects how different audiences interpret what they see. It avoids confusion, it avoids defensiveness, and it allows the characters to be understood instinctively rather than explained away after the fact. That, however, is not the approach that has been taken, and the consequences are almost visible throughout, the Japanese characters included. Roman Reigns, whatever you think of him as a performer, looks absolutely nothing like Akuma, not in build, not in presence, and not in the cultural or symbolic way Takuma is supposed to carry. Akuma is ascetic, brutal, almost monk-like in his severity. Reigns is a polished modern wrestling star whose entire aura is built around charisma and spectacle rather than spiritual menace. The gap there isn't subtle. And then there's Andrew Schultz, whose casting has provoked even sharper backlash. Schultz doesn't just look nothing like Dan Hibiki, he embodies the exact opposite energy. Dan is a parody within Japanese martial culture, a joke about failed imitation and unearned confidence in a very specific context. Schultz, by contrast, reads as an aggressively contemporary American comic persona dropped wholesale into a role that was never designed to accommodate it. That's why people are particularly angry about this one. It feels less like an adaptation and more like a replacement, as if the character's original purpose has been discarded entirely in favour of recognisability and star power. At that point, fans aren't reacting to change, they're reacting to erasure. And just to be clear, this confusion is not limited to the Japanese characters alone. Once you step back and look at the wider roster, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore, one that makes it increasingly hard to argue that there is any coherent casting philosophy at work beyond a blunt sense of marketability. Instead of a carefully constructed world where each fighter represents something distinct, what begins to emerge is a gradual flattening of identity where specificity is repeatedly sacrificed in favour of a kind of global sameness. Take Cammy White, for example. In the games, Cammy is not simply a soldier, she is a very particular European presence, cold, precise and presented as British. Her entire character is built around discipline and control, not glamour. The trailer shows that she is now being portrayed by Mel Johnson, a Thai Australian actress who is undeniably attractive, but doesn't look like the Cammy audiences will be familiar with. Everyone has recognised Cammy as blonde, blue-eyed and distinctly European for over 30 years, not as a vague aesthetic choice, but as part of how immediately legible she is as a character within Street Fighter's exaggerated global shorthand. When that sharpness is removed, she stops reading as a Delta Red operative and starts reading as a broadly marketable action heroine, and the world loses yet another layer of definition. This problem becomes even more pronounced with M. Bison. Bison is not meant to read as a clever manipulator who survives on intellect alone. He is a physical tyrant, a dictator whose menace comes from dominance as much as ideology. So, casting David Dasmalchian, a noticeably slender and cerebral performer, fundamentally alters how that character registers on screen, and many fans have been blunt in saying he simply looks weak for the role. The result is a Bison who feels less like an overwhelming force and more like an imitation of an imitation, not so much drawn from the games as gesturing towards Raul Julia's theatrical take in the 1994 film, which itself was already a stylized departure. That performance was arguably a silver lining of an otherwise infamous adaptation, but leaning back towards it rather than the source material only highlights the problem, and in doing so, it quietly abandons what Bison was actually created to represent in the first place. Not every casting choice is aesthetically off though, and that's precisely what makes the misfires more frustrating. The clearest contrast is Cody Rhodes as Guile. There is a clear physical resemblance there, the build, the posture, the exaggerated presence, and they are both explicitly American, which immediately anchors the character in a way that feels intentional rather than approximate. That choice works, and in doing so it quietly proves the point. The filmmakers do understand Street Fighter's visual language when they decide to respect it. Balrog, Blanka, Zangief, Chun-Li and Dalsim all retain enough surface resemblance to their game counterparts that you can immediately tell who they're meant to be. The silhouettes are broadly there, the physical cues are recognisable, and at a glance they read correctly on screen. And that matters because Street Fighter has always relied on instant visual legibility. The issue isn't that these castings are unrecognisable, it's that elsewhere the film shows a willingness to abandon that same standard, creating inconsistency rather than a clear reinterpretation. By contrast, E. Honda, played by a Japanese wrestler, works precisely because physical presence is allowed to do the heavy lifting. In those moments, WOD snaps into focus and it becomes clear that fidelity was never the problem. Some casting choices are rooted in a clear understanding of silhouette, physicality and cultural meaning, while others are transparently driven by marketability and name recognition. The result isn't a cohesive world, but a collection of individual decisions pulling in different directions, undermining the exaggerated global fantasy that once defined the series. And this is where the adaptation stops feeling like a reinterpretation and starts to look like a fundamental misunderstanding. Not a malicious one and not an ideologically motivated one, but a structural failure, where the people making these decisions appear to be working with a simplified, surface-level idea of what Street Fighter is and how it communicates. It is important to be clear that this is not a blanket failure across the entire cast. There are choices here that work, that align with the internal logic of the games, and that demonstrate an understanding of how physicality and presence are supposed to function within this universe. And when those choices appear, they stand out precisely because they feel deliberate. They make it obvious that the outcome of this was not inevitable, but that the problems on display are the results of decisions and not limitations. That is what makes some of the omissions and misjudgments harder to ignore, and none of it is more glaring than the absence of Sagat. Sagat is not optional, and he is not a niche favourite reserved for a long-time devotees. He is one of the foundational figures of the franchise, the original final boss, and a central pillar of its early narrative structure. His rivalry with Ryu is not a background detail, it is one of the defining relationships that gives Street Fighter its early shape and tension. Leaving him out of a film built around a global martial arts tournament is not a bold, creative choice. It is evidence that the hierarchy of the source material has not been properly understood. When a project makes room for novelty while excluding something so structurally important, it becomes impossible to argue that fidelity was ever a guiding principle. It signals a preference for spectacle over substance and for surface recognition over internal logic. In a franchise founded on exaggerated national representation and clearly defined archetypes, removing one of the most significant representatives without a compelling narrative reason undermines the very concept on which the series was built. It's also worth briefly acknowledging that part of this discourse around the film has spilled beyond casting lists and into direct public back and forths. A particular flashpoint involved my husband, Top Hat Gaming Man, who uploaded a video critiquing several of the casting choices, including Orville Peck, who is portraying Vega in the film. Peck publicly responded to that criticism, later removed the comment, and shortly afterwards there were noticeable changes to publicly available biographical information, not as proof of conspiracy or scandal, but as confirmation that the reaction is being noticed. The cast is not operating in isolation, and the discomfort many fans are expressing is clearly registering. That said, this isn't the core issue, and it doesn't deserve to dominate the conversation. Richard has uploaded a full rebuttal to that exchange on his channel today, so if you want the exclusive deep dive on that specific situation, it's already there. So check that out on the Top Hat Gaming Man channel after you're finished watching this upload. What is more revealing than Orville's reaction, so much though, is the response from sections of the audience who seem determined to defend the film before it has demonstrated anything worth defending. There is a strain of defensive optimism at work, where skepticism is treated as hostility and criticism is dismissed as bad faith. That reaction is understandable, particularly given that a small number of video game adaptations have succeeded in recent years. Detective Pikachu was enjoyable, the Sonic films worked because they embraced their absurdity rather than apologising for it, and the Mario movie succeeded because Nintendo retained control and refused to let Hollywood reinterpret the fundamentals. But isolated successes do not indicate a broader change in approach. For every adaptation that works, there are several where creators believed they understood the source material better than the audience that loved it, and the results were predictably disastrous. History does not support blind optimism, and pointing that out is not negativity, it is experience. As for my own position, it's uncomplicated. I will watch this film. I expect it to be bad. That expectation is not rooted in hostility or resentment, but in a pattern recognition. If it is bad, then my skepticism was justified. If it surprises me, then I will be genuinely pleased to say so. The fact of the matter is that Street Fighter did not need fixing. It already represented the world of clarity, confidence and exaggeration. When that clarity is lost, no amount of reassurance can replace it. If Hollywood wants audiences to trust adaptations again, the solution is not scolding, not spin, and not telling fans they are wrong for noticing when something feels off. It is understanding why these properties worked in the first place and having the restraint to preserve that logic rather than reshaping it into something safer and flatter and ultimately less interesting. And don't forget that I've put a link below where you can grab Street Fighter 6 Seasons 1 and 2 Fighters Edition at 30% off, or the Ultimate Season 3 Pass at 24% off. And while you're there, you'll also find discounts for up to 90% across thousands of other games, including pretty much every Street Fighter title that's ever existed. Each purchase will get you a bargain and go towards funding this channel, or if you want to support what I do in a more personal way and gain access to my classic behind the scenes Chun-Li cosplay photos and more by backing this channel over on Patreon. So thank you to everyone who supports what I do, and if you want to see the Orville Peck video, you can click it via my end card now. So see you soon.